Welcome back to the Stay Spicy podcast. This season, we are helping you bust myths and redefine leadership for current and aspiring leaders. We've already talked about boss holes, how to spot them, and what to do if you have one. But what if you are the leader of your organization or your team, and you're having issues with your team? Turnover, trouble recruiting, maybe not performing. Well, we believe that everything, pretty much, tracks back to culture.
So if you're having trouble finding people, I'm back with the stats. 81% of workers feel that corporate culture is somewhat or very important in deciding whether they apply for a job. And 86% of job seekers avoid companies with a bad reputation. Well, no brainer there, I guess.
Who goes towards a company with a bad reputation? Who are these like 20% of people? Idiots.
Don't listen to us. And when you have people, what are you doing to keep them? So, you've had hired people, and millennials prioritize people and cultural fit above everything else, and they make up a majority of the workforce. So, you really have to start catering to the people that are working for you instead of trying to make the system fit into them. If you can't recruit or keep people, you can't hit your KPIs, and you keep saying, we have a great culture, but, you have a culture problem. And, who's killing the culture? What's killing the culture? That's what we want to talk about today.
Culture killers.
Yes. Qu'est-ce que c'est? Run, 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 run away.
Oh.
It's not bad. Not bad.
All right, we're going to take that one on the road.
Talking Heads, anyone? Culture
Yeah.
Killers. You do need to download that song for Halloween. I play it every year at Halloween. And as the kids say, where were you in the 1900s when this song came out?
If you don't know the song, it's called Psycho Killer, not Culture Killer. We did a little adaptation, and we had to sing it for copyright purposes.
And now all of the podcast budget is going to them. But yeah, I mean...
Culture killers.
What is a culture killer, Lynette?
What or who, I guess. Everybody thinks of a culture killer as like a person, right?
Yeah.
We've all been on these teams where we think about that person right there, Sheila, Bart, I don't know, that person. Who's Bart? His name Bart. That person is the culture killer.
Yeah.
But the thing is like, what if that person leaves the organization? Either they quit or they get fired, and then the whiff, the stench of the drama still remains. And no amount of air freshener can cover up the stench of that shit. So that's the thing, is a culture killer is not a single person. And I've gone into organizations that had dumpster fire cultures, and they had completely almost turned over, but it was almost like a whack-a-mole of culture problems that kept cropping up no matter how many new people you brought in. Because that's the thing, is culture killers are not necessarily about a person. They can become deeply embedded into the ethos of an organization or a team. Could be, just a team within an organization. And they become really hard to eradicate or root out. Yeah. And so what we want to talk about today is, what are some of the top culture killers in an organization or a team that you should be on the lookout for? Basically, how do you know if you have a culture problem?
Yeah, and it's like you said, the whack-a-mole game. You can haul the bad rodent out, but there's still going to be a ton cropping up. And it's still the same game.
Yeah.
Look at me go.
Because new people come in and they look around them and they adapt to what they see.
Exactly.
Right? The new person isn't going to change the culture. It has to be an intentional, systematic change. And, spoiler alert, that change has got to come from the top.
Yeah.
But we'll talk about that in a hot minute. First, we want to talk about our culture killers.
Yes.
Qu'est-ce que c'est
and culture killer. So we've created a list of the top and most common culture killers we've experienced. But we are looking forward to talking with our guests and talking with some of you about the ones that you've experienced. So the first one I'm going to kick off with, we talked about it in the Boss Holes episode, but
the first episode as a leadership myth.
Was it the first one? Okay. Yeah. No crying in baseball. So, Harvard Business Review talks a lot about this and the idea that people are not supposed to show emotions at work. They're not allowed to, and that can really affect culture. So, I was reading an article about the idea that companies are focused on building cognitive culture, but they're focused less on building emotional cultures in the workforce. So, some companies are really trying to combat this now. So they've gone so far as to ask people throughout the day how they're feeling. So, when you go to a bathroom at an amusement park and you can, if it's clean, you can put a happy face, and they have these little buttons that you press and stuff like that. They've started doing that in workplaces and using different technologies. And what they're doing is to try to get an idea of people's emotions. So if they're happy, if they're not throughout the day, that kind of thing. So this is actually a way for them to understand what motivates people and understand what's actually making people sad or happy. So no crying in baseball. Again, we're going back to that League of Their Own reference where we tell the baseball players who are all women that they're not supposed to cry in baseball because it's a big men burly sport. We actually do want emotional intelligence in the workplace. We actually do want that as part of culture, understanding people's backgrounds, understanding their uniqueness, understanding their styles, and creating space for people to express themselves as human beings. And, to a certain extent in the past couple of years, understanding trauma and how it affects people and how they show up in the workplace. So there's a lot of that in values-based leadership. There's a lot of those things that we're building into cultures, and as culture experts are starting to analyze workplaces, they're realizing that the emotional aspect is a good thing and it's missing in a lot of systems.
Yeah. So if you have a workplace culture that doesn't encourage people to be human, to show emotion, to bring their whole self to work. Now we're not talking about like dumping your whole personal life into a company meeting,
right?
But creating space. If there's no space and nobody really cares about each other as people, like and then that becomes really hard but not impossible in a virtual environment. That's another thing is like you can tend to dehumanize people when you're only dealing over email or message, like instant messenger. Because you're reading your own things into that. You're not looking the person in the eyes. You're not having a human conversation. And so if there's sort of a culture of dehumanizing or othering as well, that's another part of this. There's no crying in baseball. It's like there's no emotions at work, but also it's, oh, well, this department is this and this department is that. It's funny you said about the emotions thing. So one of the things I did with my team is every team meeting, I would have weekly all team, like kind of leadership team meetings. And I would start every meeting with a feelings check-in, and some people fucking hated it. Oh, it was hilarious. Like definitely there was a cultural element to like who would hate it most. And then sometimes just people who weren't used to that kind of thing, right? Depending on which industry they came from. I broadened it, not just a feelings word, but I just said, give me a word or a phrase for where you're at today or this week. Mm-hmm. You can either explain it or you can not. You can just say it and like, let that be it. So I give people the freedom to kind of make it their own, but we're going to start this off by being human before we dive into work stuff. It's like, what's your word? Where are you at? And some people would they would default to talking about their work, but at least it was like you could draw them out. And for me as a leader, it was a way of getting a feel for where people were at, but also for people not to feel alone. So if somebody was saying, oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or somebody else was like, I'm really excited, it might help other people. Other people could empathize, or other people might say, oh yeah, me too. So bringing that forward in a meeting. But yeah, especially when people would join the team, new people, I'd be like, okay, here, heads up. This is happening. You're probably going to hate it, but you'll grow into it. And a lot of people ended up really liking some of these formats over time once they got over the shock of this is different. So yeah, the whole absence of feelings and humanizing in a workplace, that's a culture killer.
And I love that because it's a reminder to everybody that you're in control of how you show up. Mm-hmm. So I'm a recovering perfectionist. And as a recovering perfectionist, I went into a meeting one time, and the person who was leading the workshop said, how, think about how much you want to show up today or how much energy you have. So you might be a 5 out of 10. You might be a 7 out of 10. You might be a 3 out of 10. You might be exhausted, right? And I thought, that's an option. People can actually decide, like, they don't have to be at a 10 every single time they show up to every single thing. And I realized that was a way to, like, not only communicate how I was feeling and be honest about it, but also like regulate my energy levels and how I showed up to things. So that, I think, gets people thinking. Those feelings check-ins, they get people thinking about, pausing and being more aware. And I think awareness is important, especially in culture, because you have to be aware of how you are interacting with others. So.
Well, and if you're not also explaining the context behind your feelings, people will fill in the blanks with their own information, which is never usually good.
No.
So if somebody's, chronically late for something, or somebody forgets to do something, or doesn't respond to an email, or what have you, we will fill in the blanks in our mind with the why, right? Oh, that person's a flake, or that person just doesn't really care about my stuff. And it's usually the negative, but that's usually almost never the reason. So if you don't create a culture of openness and context and feelings and having real conversations, and you've got this mentality of it's just business, there's no crying in baseball, that's how those divisions breed, because people will they'll other each other, and they will dehumanize, and they'll attribute intent where there maybe isn't any, and you'll start to see this divisiveness in the team. So to me, this whole absence of humanity in the workplace is the biggest culture killer.
Well, I think that breeds fear too, which brings us to the next culture killer, which is fear factor. Yeah.
Yep. Culture of fear. And it stems from this sort of inability to be human and be real. But anytime there's a massive fear in a workplace. So in the last episode with Boss Holes, we talked about creating this culture of fear of being fired. But that it can be broader than that, right? It's not just fear, but there can be this, this is why people hoard information, or if somebody's afraid to speak up, for example, challenge anything. One of the things I used to say with my team was, and we talked about how someone will say, I like being challenged. I mean, who likes being challenged? But then they'll shut it down. But I would encourage my team to say, and I would give reasons, because I would say, if I'm saying something, I need you to ask questions or to present an alternative, because I don't always have all the information. And maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's a better way of doing it that I haven't thought of. So you need to question that. And I might still consider it and go with this course of action, but I still need to hear it. So I would have that conversation. But in a lot of workplaces, nobody will, it's just do what the boss says, because we're afraid to rock the boat. We're afraid to question it. And if anybody is ever fearful in a workplace, that's a massive culture killer, because we talked about fear responses: fight, flight, freeze. Do those sound like a productive work environment to you?
No.
People in the flight, fight, or freeze mode? That sounds the opposite of productivity. So when people say, oh, fear is a good motivator, I think that's complete bullshit. And so even if one person is afraid, fear also kind of breeds on itself, I find as well, because then somebody else sees that, hears that, and goes, well, maybe I should be afraid too. And then it starts to grow on itself.
Yeah, exactly. And it's scary, right? Because then you have people not giving good advice. Everybody's smiling and nodding at the senior level. Then it just trickles down. Nobody can ask questions because you don't have the answers, because you're doing what you're told. And yeah, it doesn't take long for that kind of, I don't want to say dictatorship, but for lack of a better word, to start like stabbing at a culture.
Yeah, and this fear can breed into across teams, right? Like this sense of hoarding information or mistrust. That's the thing, is fear breeds mistrust as well, which brings us to the next one about not acting as a team.
Yeah, there's no I in team, right? So it's funny because as a consultant, a lot of the work I do is starting with organizations when they're still small. So they're trying to build a foundation for their communications or whatever that might be. And I always find as organizations get bigger and bigger and bigger, you always have to be like really aware of the fiefdoms that people want to build. So When an organization is small and it's, full of piss and vinegar and it's just like ready to go out and conquer the world, it's probably a year old or something. It's really focused on goals. It's really focused on accomplishing like a really great project or delivering on an amazing mandate. And everybody is just doing what they can to make that happen. And I love that phase because I find it so positive, so inspiring. There's ideas are kings. People are forming, the organization's in its infancy and it's like building itself. And I just love that. So that's great. But as organizations start to build, they start to lose that sort of freedom, that sort of creativity, that sort of buzz. And it becomes all these divisions, all these departments. And each individual department is now, well, I'm responsible for this. I'm not responsible for that. And, oh, that's communications. Oh, we want to do a really great ad campaign. Oh, well, actually, that's not our responsibility. That's marketing. We don't give a shit if that succeeds or not. And then you get all these little like pipelines and little fiefdoms, and they don't work together. They don't communicate together. Everyone's focused on their budgets. Everyone's focused on that. And then it's not about the big picture of the organization. It's not about the audience. It's not about the customer. You name it. I've seen it across private and public sector. So that to me breeds starts to create toxic workplaces because it's not a workplace culture where people feel like they can cross collaborate and solve a problem and focus on goals. It ends up being what's best for the branch. And that depends on your leader. So you've probably seen this. You've worked for big and small organizations.
Yep. And there's some like natural ones where there's just naturally like friction, right? Usually in any kind of organization, the people sort of on the front line, and they call it like kind of front line and back office, there's friction between them, right? Because they see themselves as having different motivations, different end goals. But this is where like the top leadership comes in, that they should be constantly reminding people of the common goal and the vision and their role in getting there.
Right.
But if you don't have that, everybody will naturally do that protective thing of, well, this is my thing, my KPIs, and these people are getting in the way. So there was always like finance and business development, even marketing and business development. So I had marketing and business development both under me, and they should be aligned, but there was always this, well, the marketing team this and the business development team that. And that's that othering that I was talking about too with when you start to dehumanize people and it's like you kind of attribute characteristics to them and they're separate from you.
Yes.
I also had, even within the same team and in a sales and business development world, where somebody was refusing to share information about their clients with the organization because of quote unquote confidentiality. And I had this big argument with someone where I'm like, but it's not confidential from your boss. Yes, there's a high degree of confidentiality associated with this client's project, but you don't get to kind of hold that to yourself and not share information with anybody within our company.
Within the same company.
Yes.
And it's so funny because we're supposed to be sharing information now. We have systems in place. So if you have like Salesforce or you have SharePoint or whatever you might use to have social media, whatever, like everybody has to share that and everything has to look outwardly with some consistency. And how are you able to provide services if people that you work with are not allowing you to do your job well?
I also forced sales teams to create deal teams and work as kind of a group, because my view is no one person has all the experience and all the answers to do everything, right? But in these cultures, these I cultures, the culture killers, the thing you hear most often, it was just easier, faster if I do it myself. This person doesn't know. Well, how are they going to know if you don't bring them in on something? How are they going to learn? And so maybe there's a little bit more work up front to work as a team, but there's less work on the back end. But it's that default to it's easier, faster if I do it myself, or if you got it, or that old adage of if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. And it's those mindsets that are the hallmark of, those are culture killers, because then everybody just retreats to their own little corners, and it's not efficient. It's not productive in the end. One of the best pieces of advice I got from a mentor was change your mindset by saying, it may not be perfect. So this is helpful for you. It may not be perfect. It may not be the way I would do it, but does it get us closer to the goal?
Yeah.
And thinking about it in that context. And then also thinking about being a peer mentor. So maybe it is faster if you do it yourself this one time, but if you bring somebody else in on the project, it actually helps them learn more and about your department or become a better part of the organization. And so be big. It's got to be about bigger than yourself. And that's another thing I used to say to the team is that we don't want people on the team where they're the biggest consideration.
Exactly. And that could go all the way up to the CEO. I know.
Yes. It should.
Yeah, absolutely. And I read an article about the CEO of LinkedIn, and they weren't able to get all their work done. They needed a chief of staff, et cetera, et cetera. And it was the whole idea of like, when you pass on specific amounts of authority to another person, like you said, it's not necessarily how I would do it. You are assuming that 30% of the time they're not going to do it the way you want it, or they're going to make mistakes, or they're going to take it and run with it and do it completely different, or they may go against your advice. But you have to be able to open those doors and do that. And that's how you run successful corporations. I mean, I think LinkedIn's pretty successful, so I would take that advice.
Yeah.
But, being able to just let go and do that builds great culture because it shows that you trust people around you.
Yes.
And if I don't trust people, then, I can't work with them. And I don't like that. So I think, the team energy is where you need to be, and the goal energy is where you need to be. You remember why you're there to deliver a mandate. So.
Well, and some of the biggest challenges I had in organizations were exactly what you said. It was going from that startup mode to scale up mode, because you went from certain people wearing lots of hats and loving that space to saying, okay, you're now going to specialize in this hat. You got to give these hats away because we're going to grow. And some people had a really hard time with that. And that's natural. That's change, right? And you can work through that. But if somebody is unwilling to give something to someone else or to shift, right, for the betterment of the organization, because it's all about them, then that's going to breed culture killing, right? It's just that's going to catch on. You can't have that one person holding on to their pieces or having this mentality that my needs are more important than the greater good of the team.
Right. And when you talk about the greater good of the team, it's also talking about, gossip and rumors and the culture around those toxic teams. So
yep.
How do you deal with rumors, and how is that a big culture killer?
Oh yeah. Rumors and I guess gossip culture.
Right.
Is a big one. And I've dealt with that. Some of how you can identify that you have a gossip culture, because gossip is kind of ubiquitous now. It's just like it's kind of everywhere. And, what is gossip? How do you pinpoint that you have a gossip culture? So a few things I've noticed was if there are select groups of people that have, say, a side chat or side meetings where the meetings or the chats are focused on talking about other people in the organization, a specific person, a department, a group of people, that is gossip culture. And that is bad news. Like it's hard. It's really hard to root that out because we had a situation like that. And then those people all were gone, but almost there was one person that was still remaining. And then that still happened. And we couldn't quite figure out what that came from. So people who were part of it, they have a hard time letting it go because maybe that's how they felt safe or they felt they had control. And then they'll kind of recreate it with new people. So it's that whack-a-mole again. If there was a gossip culture and you try to root it out, you try to build out transparency, some people will continue to try to go behind people's backs. Another aspect of it too is not just within the organization, but outside the organization. If you hear people talking about their colleagues or the organization negatively outside the organization, it comes back to you. That's indicative of a bit of a gossip culture as well. Because then again, when you say something, it's always going to come back around. Like there's nothing you can say that's just going to stay secret.
No.
And so that makes people feel unsafe as well and disloyal. So this whole notion of gossip, rumors, you know, kind of cliques and secret chats and secret meetings, that's all really toxic to a culture.
And I think that there's a misconception that if you just remove the gossipy person or you deal with that person or you deal with a toxic person, that's suddenly just going to be lifted and it's going to be sunshine and rainbows. And is that the case, or is it just sort of, how do you kind of build from there? Because I think people think that you just need to get rid of the person that's the problem.
No, because like I said, like the culture, the person, maybe there's one person who's kind of the ringleader or who is initiating a lot of it, but it starts to seep into everybody else's behaviors. So it's actually about changing behaviors as opposed to changing out the person. Now, if somebody's unwilling to change their behavior, then you probably need to change out that person. But you're having to change out, and it's also about modeling, right? And being really consistent. It's kind of like, I mean, I don't have children, but I imagine it's like teaching children or a pet, right? You have to model behavior. You have to be consistent. You have to communicate clearly. So there's all these things. And we're going to talk in future episodes as well about some tips for building great culture, but it isn't simply like if you identify one of these culture killers, it's not just about plucking out one person who you think is the bad apple.
No.
Because there's rot around it. And the other thing too is is it coming from higher up?
Yeah. What makes that person feel comfortable being able to freely act that way?
Yeah. Is it being condoned, tolerated, supported, protected, that kind of behavior? That's the other thing too, is that the why of it all is not just, I think asking why is really important too. So when you're thinking about, okay, so I've got this behavior happening in my team or the organization, we always go to solution and we don't stop to think about, why are they acting this way? Are they feeling fearful? Are they feeling seen? Is there spaces, are we creating collaborative spaces?
Right.
One of the things I identified with some of the stuff we've talked about is exactly what I was talking about with the distance thing. So people were not feeling that sort of peer loyalty or respecting each other or peer accountability because they didn't have a relationship with each other. And so our organization, it was challenging because it was virtual, but I had to find ways of helping people build actual relationships with each other. Otherwise, why would you give a shit about that person's email? Or, why wouldn't you talk shit about them in a meeting quietly with your friend and chat? We've all been on those. By the way, I have to call this out. This is another gossip culture thing that I freaking hate. So we've all been on those like Teams meetings or big Zoom meetings where you see one person on the screen. You've got like all the Family Feud squares or whatever. You got one person who will look down and message on a phone or something, and then another person starts laughing and messages, and you can tell that they're like messaging each other.
They're talking
and giggling
to each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And your instant reaction is like, especially if you're presenting, you're speaking, is like, oh, they're making fun of me. Or either way, they're having a side conversation about a group meeting. And when you think about it, before COVID, we weren't really able to do that. So I do think that this has been a culture killer that has gotten worse post-COVID, because we would be on Teams meetings and you'd be private messaging each other about, oh, isn't this ridiculous? And look at that person's hair and something.
Maybe that's the benefit to the horrible Teams update that came out at the new year. Yeah. We couldn't use Teams forever. It just kept crashing. So no one could gossip about each other.
But yeah, that the other thing that's another hallmark of gossip culture is if somebody says one thing and then it makes its way around the organization in like 60 seconds. Mm-hmm. I've had that before where somebody's like, oh, I heard there's, we're going to be switching to Google Drive or something like that. And then all of a sudden everybody's freaking out about that. And you're like, how did that even become a thing? It's not even true. So if some rumor or something kind of crops up or gets distorted, but it spreads fast, then you've got gossip culture.
Yeah. And the importance of addressing it.
Yeah.
As someone who works in internal communications as well. really important to like nip it in the bud and address it. And that's what a healthy culture will do, bring people together and find out why that's happening, and then start addressing those rumors as well in terms of like better internal communications. And that's like, that brings us to the next one is, you know, the bus stops here, we call it. But
on top of you.
there are organizations where people are really comfortable throwing other people under the bus. And like,
Yep.
there are a plethora of reasons for that. But I go back to organizations getting bigger. And to me, like as an employee, I saw that people were really comfortable doing it because they lacked systems thinking. So they lacked this organizational team. So to me, like if one fails, we all fail kind of thing. Because we deal a lot with external clients. I deal a lot with events, media conferences. Like it's all very public. So at the end of the day, like the audience, the people on the receiving end, they don't care whose branch it was. So I just think the whole idea of throwing people under the bus is a symptom of lack of systems thinking. And again, these like little divisional fiefdoms, because people are very, very happy to say, oh, that's not our fault. That's X department. That's not our fault. That's HR. Oh, the contract's late. That's finance's fault. Like very, very happy to do that because they have no skin in the game and no direct responsibility to it.
Yeah.
And as an employee, I've seen that so many times. And I just don't think that failure is something we just throw at somebody. So cultures are very comfortable doing that. There's a lot of cultures that are really comfortable doing that, whether it's just a gossip culture where they can just say these things, or it's done very publicly in front of other people. So
Yep.
that's a massive culture killer to me when you have all of these divisions that can't see that we are one organization and how we actually want to be perceived outside of the organization.
And the cause can be many different things, right? It could be fear based, could be because there's just sort of a fear of getting fired. So it's like hot potato. Oh, not me.
Right.
It could be just a lack of feeling safe and like valuing accountability of going, you know, I've screwed that up or something, and just being able to own something and be human about it. So I actually think the bus throwing one is linked to all of the other culture killers as well. It's like they're kind of an extension of each other, but these are like indicators, you know, and it could be really subtle too. Like you said, it could be behind the scenes. It could be in front of a group of people or in an email. I had, and people can become desensitized to it as well. So somebody may see a lot of bus throwing and not even register it because it's just so commonplace around them. And they may even do it themselves without thinking about it, right? Just sort of calling somebody out. It's throwing somebody on the bus is very different than holding someone accountable too. Because there's a way that you hold people accountable and responsible that's respectful, that's, you know, private and not blaming or shaming. That's the other thing. But I had this one instance that like sticks in my brain, and it was so innocuous, but it just, I guess I became really sensitive to bus throwing. And so I emailed somebody who reported to me and just checked in on she was fairly new to the organization. So I said, hey, how's this thing going? Have we set up a meeting for it yet? And she immediately came back and threw my EA under the bus and was like, well, you know, she didn't schedule it and I've been waiting on her. And I was like, whoa, I didn't need you could have just said, we're working on it, or, you know, I'll follow up.
Right.
Or you could have talked to her and then come back to me. But it was just a knee-jerk reaction for her to throw somebody else under the bus, even though, and ultimately she's the one responsible for getting it done, right? So maybe she wasn't the one that was doing the scheduling, but she was responsible for the action. Yeah. And so that's a thing too, where if leaders in an organization are always looking for somebody to point a finger at, or they're always blaming down, that helps breed that bus throwing culture where everybody just instinctively does it without even a thought.
Yeah, for me, it's the comfort level with doing it.
Yeah.
That is so indicative of a problem.
She probably didn't even, if you would have brought that up to her, she wouldn't have thought that she did it.
It's more like, not my fault, moving on. I'm like, it doesn't matter whose fault it is. And some people get into the fault, right? And they get focused on it. We need to get this done. And it doesn't matter who does it sometimes too.
Or who didn't do it.
Yeah.
I've definitely been thrown under the bus a time or two. And you can also see sometimes, and this is where that breeds that fear too, is like when people start to build the case, right? And they're like, you can see the bus coming. Buses are coming.
Yeah.
You're like, I can see the headlights off in the distance. It's coming for me. I'm going to stand off to the side and try to get as far out as possible. And somebody keeps pushing you into the road. You're like, what do I do? I've been guilty in some of these cultures. So this is what I was talking about where when we talked about crabs, and if you're in a toxic culture, you just do what you can to survive. And sometimes you're not your best self. So I've been in those situations where there's somebody who's just awful and making your life miserable. And you're like, I'm not going to throw them under the bus, but I'm certainly not going to pull them out of the way if I see it coming.
Well, and this is it. Like when I look to hire people or I look to find people to work for, whether that's a contractor or staffer, there's a difference. Like I look for that sort of curiosity, solution oriented versus somebody who's critical. Mm-hmm. So I often find the difference between, I don't want to say a junior and senior communications advisors, but junior folks will say, well, that person's stupid.
Yeah.
They didn't do that because it's just stupid. They don't know what they're doing. And, someone with a bit more experience or someone who's more curious will say like, well, what led them to that decision? Like, what do they know that I don't know? Instead of just writing them off as idiots and throwing them under the bus, how do I get more information from that person to do a better job? That's the mindset I'm looking for. And that's the culture I'm looking for. I'm looking for cultures and mindsets that want to make a difference and get things done.
I think something that can help combat both the bus throwing and the gossip culture is I heard this line, if you're not curious, you're judging.
Yes.
And I love that because you're one or the other. So if you're not asking why, and not why as in like, why the fuck did you do that? It's like if you're not asking, okay, what else is potentially at play here?
Like walk me through this.
Yes, help me understand. Then you're attributing a judgment to that person and their behavior and the intent behind it. Mm-hmm. And that can become a habit. So the thing with these culture killers is they're so simple and easy and they can go by without you noticing, but they breed on themselves like weeds or algae. I don't know if algae breeds on itself.
Bad fungus.
Yeah, they're a fungus. They're like a cancer in an organization, I guess is the best way to describe it. And that's why just simply kind of taking out a person or a team or something like that doesn't actually fix it. And, we talked about boss holes, and people who listen to the boss holes episode will notice there's a lot of similarities between the culture killers and the boss hole behaviors.
Yeah.
And that's not an accident because it all goes to the top. And I've been in these situations where I've had my own team and I have other people who've had teams and they have been really trying to build a good culture within their team, within their sphere of influence and even beyond that. But if there's somebody above you that tolerates, promotes, rewards that behavior, there's only so much you can do. And that's why it feels like whack-a-mole, because it has to be a whole of organization, whole of leadership team intention. It can't just be one person or one team within an organization that wants to breed this good culture, because bad culture it spreads and it's strong and it spreads like wildfire. So yeah, if you cut that one kind of tumor out, there's still stuff that lingers around it that can keep growing.
Yeah. It's everybody's problem.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. And that's actually another thing that I always told my team is that, culture is non-negotiable, but also culture is not just a me thing. It's an us thing. We all have a role to play in building the culture that we want to see. And we all have to agree on what that culture looks like.
Right. And if you're a leader and you see your organization or your team, and you are the boss, I think it's important too to take a look in the mirror and see if there's changes you can make to your own habits, your own style. Because as the stats say, you're going to continue to lose people. You're going to continue to lose productivity. So that's That's what we want to combat.
Yeah. And if you see these culture killers and you're the leader, I hate to say it, that you are part of it. Like it starts and stops with you. Yes, everybody has a role to play in culture, but the leader has the most important role to play. And that goes to the very top, right? Because you can be a leader in an organization, but again, if the person at the very top doesn't buy in and perpetuates these culture killers, then it's got to be the leader that is responsible ultimately. And then looking around, so how do you kind of vet workplaces as well? So if you're going to, if you're in a job and you see these culture killers, I think it's like, get out of there. But what about if you're looking for a job? How can you spot these things ahead of time? And I think that's where we go back to, first of all, ask around. So bad reputations are bad for a reason. So if you ask around about an organization or a leader and you get bad feedback, that's one thing. There's also things like Glassdoor. So take a look at what employees are writing on those forums, and take a look at that. And then there's also questions you can ask. So when you're interviewing the interviewer, now don't ask things like, describe your culture, because everybody's going to say we have a great culture. Like, come on. So you have to be almost sleuthier than that, if that's a word. But you have to ask things like, what gets rewarded and what are the kinds of qualities that would fit well into this team, and sort of come at it in a different way than just asking, what's your culture like?
Well, and understanding too that you're looking to fit. So if an organization has a culture that's not a fit for you, it doesn't necessarily mean they have a bad culture either. But you are ultimately looking to find your authentic fit.
Yes.
And that's the goal, right? That's how you stay spicy, because you want to be yourself, you want to put your best foot forward, and you want to find the cultures that match your values and match your ability to be the best version of yourself. So we are going to be covering a lot of those tips and ideas in future episodes. Looking forward to that. So
if you are looking for a job and you see any of these culture killers, you should run away.
Oh,
we had to get it in one more time. Culture killer, qu'est-ce que c'est? So on that note, we are going to bring a lot more of these tips to future episodes on how to build good cultures, on how to even fix good cultures, and maybe just how to blow some shit up.
Yep. We're going to change the conversation.
Change the
We're
world.
gonna break the wheel. Stay tuned, everybody.
Stay spicy.